All right. Well, and welcome everyone to the Adult Formation Hour for St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm thrilled to get to spend time today with our own Bishop Anne. Anne Hodges-Copple is our Bishop Suffragan. And I'm very careful to say one of the first things that Bishop Anne taught me back when you were our chaplain at the Episcopal Center was to never welcome a bishop to the church, because the church is actually the bishop's her own. And so we are not going to welcome you because you're already one of our own. And just as a quick word, Bishop Anne has been our Bishop Suffragan since 2013, but she has lived her entire ordained life in this diocese in North Carolina, mostly serving in the Raleigh-Durham Triangle area. And she was the campus ministry Episcopal chaplain at Duke University for a long time. She's also the rector of St. Luke's Durham before she became our bishop. And she has always had just such a wonderful passion for disenfranchised, disempowered communities, and figuring out how does mission work and look and feel in all sorts of communities within our diocese. But like I said a second ago, she is one of our own. And I have to share the personal story that Bishop Anne was our Episcopal chaplain when Mark and I were students at Duke Divinity School. Mark was her organist at the Episcopal Center.
And so much more.
And so much more. And
teacher, facilitator.
It's true. It's true. You kind of put him to work in all kinds of things, right? And Bishop Anne actually officiated Mark and I's wedding so many years ago. And and so I share that to say, I know her, but she's one of ours. She is our friend. She is our pastor, and she is here to teach us today. And so Bishop Anne, thank you for spending this time with us, and take us away.
All right. Oh, Sarah. Well, thank you so much. Let's see, how do I say this? Well, yes, and kind of want to pick up a little bit from the sermon and the readings. This great joy that we all are one in Christ, right? And so, as the bishop, it's not that the church belongs to the bishop, right? We have this horrible phrase that we're doing away with as trustees of the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee. For the longest time, we were called, and this is a painful thing to say, that bishops called themselves, or dioceses called themselves, owning dioceses. Owning. Let's just let that sink in a second, right? So we are owned in Jesus, right? We have the belongingness. And so I think when a bishop visits, part of this, the symbol and the sacrament of the bishop's office is our unity. And so that's when a bishop comes, we're not visiting, we're mostly doing a homecoming. So any bishop that comes to you is actually coming home. In that sense. And so St. Paul's is going to feel that way anyway, just because you all are so welcoming and you're so wonderful. And in a funny way, the bishop, the office of the bishop, the second bishop, reminds us that in some ways, though, we're at home because we're in Christ, right? That is our home. That is what owns our heart, so to speak. So something I'm thinking a lot about is coming out of a very hierarchical tradition, right? How do we sort of repossess those terms into the conciliar church, right? We're churches that we gather around a table. And so the bishop at the table is, especially the deacon at the table, our job is to make more and more room at the table, really. That's what it's about, making more and more people at home in God's kingdom and in the beloved community, making more and more people. And do bishops have a certain role in that? Absolutely. Do deacons, do lay people, the baptized share in all of that. So it's fun to share in all of that with you all. Again, but just as Jesus said, so that we all may be one, and no one is better than any other one. So that's, so there's just a lot of things to be thinking about these days as we move forward. And if you heard the sermon, that is what I am all about, is what does it mean to move past the pandemic, right? What does that mean? And as you heard me say in the sermon, I don't think this is about going back to normal. And we're occasionally going to use those, oh, it's nice to be back in church, or it's nice to do this. There's nice to see things coming back to us that we value, right? About community, about gathering. It's nice to see some of those signs of our life in Christ that we've been not denied for a little while. Some of those signs of life, like in spring, are coming back. But the thing that's critical for us as Christians is that we are on this journey that's always faith forward, that draws strength from the past, that uses the past to work into the ground of our being, but still continues to sort of launch us into an uncertain future. And the devil is so clever. The devil is so clever. So what the devil would like to tell me is, oh, everything's predictable. Everything's controllable. Let's do things the way we've always done it. Let's do things that make us feel the most comfortable. That ain't God talking. That's not how God talks. If you look at the disciples, it's not that they were comfortable in their faith. They were courageous in their faith. And they had to get pushed forward to do all sorts of uncomfortable things. I think that's the story of discipleship. But as I was thinking about our reemergence in the Easter season, and at least some of the more obvious effects and limitations of the pandemic starting to recede, though not completely gone, I wondered what biblical, I do believe in using the treasures of the tradition of the past to teach us how to move forward. So I thought, well, where in Scripture have the people of God been through a rather traumatic season of community life, and then have been in some sense compelled forward, in some liberating sense compelled forward? So I thought we might consider, I've picked out 3 different sort of stories from Scripture that you are more or less familiar with. And we're going to kind of think about what those stories might have to tell us, how they might become useful as we move into a really uncertain future and out of a very, very traumatic time. So the first one, I think wasn't going to use this one, but of course there's the expulsion of Adam and Eve, right? I mean, that's a big one. That was pretty traumatic. They were pretty comfortable where they were, and they were sent forward. But that's not really where I thought we would first start. I think I start with the people of God, the liberated people of God, leaving captivity in Egypt and spending all that time in the wilderness. I don't know about you all, but this past year, so much, I was so grateful last summer that in the daily office, we were the murmuring, grumbling people in the wilderness. Like, God, we know you've got this, and we know you'll lead this through. Can we make it very, very clear to you? We don't like this one little bit, right? It's very Israelite, very grumbling people, complaining about the food, kind of wishing we were back in Egypt, like all of that story. So, and it's interesting, right? They're going through the wilderness for 40 years. God help us that we're not doing this for 40 years. 40 years where they had to reinvent themselves, right? They kind of had to reinvent how they gathered or couldn't gather, what they were going to do, how they were going to find food for the journey, for the body, for the mind, and the spirit. And it was a very instructive season. But let's think about where they were going. They were going to a promised land that they had, none of them had ever seen, but in some ways, right, think about it, they were returning to the land of their ancestors, right, to the land that Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob, where they had been, their ancestors had been. So there's a sense that they're going forward. There's a sense that they're going back. There's a sense that God has promised they're going to get out of the wilderness, right? So they get to that Jordan River. Remember, it's the Jordan that they cross over back into Canaan, back into the promised land. what's it? What do we know that they don't know that's ahead for them? Think about that for a minute. In the promised land. Hey, say it, Elizabeth.
Giants.
Well, there be giants. Yes, thank you. There be giants in those mountains. There's a whole other people there. There are other tribes and cultures and languages and people. There's going to be some high drama in the promised land. It's not like, this is the land of milk and honey, but what happens as soon as they get over there? Where is that milk and honey that we were all holding out for, right? So even when we emerge from a season that's been so difficult, where we've think about those Israelites, they lost a generation. I don't even like to think about that, applying that to our current situation. They lost a generation in the wilderness, right? So I think that is one important narrative. Like, to be liberated by God doesn't mean to get liberated into an easy life. There's nothing easy about the promised land. Not on this earth. Not on this earth, there isn't. And there's nothing easy about figuring out our identity as we work out identity issues with the other people around us, right? Because that's part of the work they're having to do. And God puts certain limitations on. You don't like masks? Well, go read the Old Testament. That's a lot of limitations. Where you can go, what you can eat, what you can wear, when you can. You think we got protocols? Talk to the people of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. They understand protocols, right? So it's interesting. Even in the promised land, there are disciplines of the community for the sake of keeping the community safe. Well, now, there seems like there's some resonance there, that even as we move forward, we will still be mindful of all the work it takes to keep everyone in our community safe and whole and protected and thriving. Okay, so there's a lot that goes on there. And then how to be an identifiable people with an identifiable culture and religion, while also figuring out how to live with the others who are already there. Well, there's a lot of resonance there. All right, park that for a second. So that's the Israelites coming out of the wilderness into the promised land. There's another extremely important to us as the spiritual ancestors, as the spiritual descendants from our spiritual ancestors. There are the exiles. Do you know what I mean by the exiles? There are the people of God who were in captivity in Babylon, who had Jerusalem destroyed twice, who are given the means of returning from captivity. The exiles return to rebuild Jerusalem. This is Nehemiah, Ezra. These are the people. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. So the people of God who've been living in a certain kind of exile in a foreign land, very limited on what they were allowed to do, go back, right? And don't you know, they were all saying, thank goodness we are going back. We're going to get life back to normal. It's all going to be great. But was it? I mean, think about it. When they got back to Jerusalem, it had been destroyed. The temple wasn't there anymore. And what they did, though, is they still had the foundations, spiritually and archaeologically. They had the foundations of their faith. They had the traditions of their faith, but they had to rebuild, but not replicate. Do you understand what I mean? They did not replicate the worship or the building of the past. They rebuilt it for the sake of the current and the future. Isn't that interesting? They were in a certain kind of captivity. They were going back to a place that should be familiar. Whoops, did I lose you? Should be familiar to them. I wonder what it's going to be like. On one hand, we're going to return to our churches, and obviously our buildings are familiar, the liturgies are familiar, all of that. But is that good enough? Is that faithful enough? Or do we think need to think more deeply about how we're going to use the treasures of our past, the treasures of our inheritance, to equip ourselves to build the kind of communities for the present and the future? There are people who are looking for Jesus. Sarah talked about, I think if someone were to do one of those articles on me of how has your mind changed, over my 33 years of ordination, how has your mind changed? I would say I am not as interested anymore in what I can do for others. I am increasingly aware that maybe all my efforts to do things for others needs to recede, and I need to do more about walking with others, listening to others, understanding that there are stories that I have ignored or trampled over or misunderstood, and that creating room in the liturgy and the life of the church is going to be hard work. Let me give you an example. The diocese is doing a lot of work around racial reconciliation and racial justice. We're doing a lot of work there. It means telling some really painful stories about the ways that the white church stole wealth from Black people in North Carolina. There's some painful stories out there, painful stories about bishops, about people, about all sorts of things. And that's why I was talking this morning in the sermon. We're gonna have to explore some of the wounds that are still in our body, because unaddressed, untreated, they will continue to fester in ways that affect the whole body. When part of the body is harmed, it's gonna affect the whole body. When part of the body is infected, untreated, it will impact the whole body. You can't cut it off or ignore it or deny it. Part of the body may hurt more than another part of the body, but the whole body has been harmed. That is a metaphor for us around the work we need to do to go back in time and tell that we are going to go back in history to tell the truth about history. That is hard work. That is hard work. That is sacred work. That is sacred. Why do we have a lectionary? To go back to the stories. And one of the great things in my life is the more you go back, the more you see things you hadn't seen before. How great is that? That you think you know it, and then you go back to that story and like, I never noticed those Hebrew midwives in Exodus chapter 1, who were actually the literal deliverers of Moses, the deliverer. You just heard about Moses. You didn't hear about the women that actually organized the resistance movement that made it possible to rescue the Hebrew children from death. I mean, that says a lot of different. Once I heard the story of the Hebrew midwives, which I did not hear for many, many years, I could hear ministry differently. Anyway, but what I'm saying is, when we're the exiles, I wonder what the pandemic of this virus and the pandemic of oppressing people out of either their culture, their color, their language, oppressing people, if that has not been a terrible infection in our corporate body, that by addressing and healing as painful. Have you ever taken a child to the doctor and the doctor was going to have to do something painful to the child? You're just like, oh, I one time had to take, I guess it was Tom, and I don't know, it's a vaccination. There was some big shot he had to get. We had to hold him down, and he looked at me like I was Judas incarnate. Like, how could you let them do this to me? But you had to, right? I knew that the discomfort he was going to experience was going to actually be a means of him becoming a healthier member of the community. So what do we need to learn about, what kind of land have we been living in? Maybe like some of you at different times, I have wanted to say when I've seen certain things on television or in the videos, like, that's not America. And then I'm like, hmm, hmm, hmm. Maybe this is America. There are things and wounds that have to be addressed if we're going to heal into a greater whole, a greater wholeness. I think that's true of the church. I think that's true of the country. And it can start right here in Forsyth County. You don't have to go very far, do you? And you're doing that work. You're doing that work. Okay, so that's the exiles coming out of a certain kind of captivity. Let's get back to what's great, but let's not go back to what was awful. But let's get back to the work God has given us to do to build the beloved community. All right, so biblical story number 3. And y'all have heard me talk about this a million times, and I'm just not going to stop talking about it because it kind of picks up with something Bishop Curry used to talk about back a while back. But I put my own little special spin on it. When the risen Lord appears in all those variety of places, but particularly in Matthew, he says, "Go back to Galilee. I'll meet you there. Go back to Galilee." Okay, well, wait, Galilee? That's like, go back. Let me think. I don't want to disparage anybody. Let's see. Go back to Pecos, Texas. Don't go to Washington, D.C. Go back to Toya, Texas. Go back to some godforsaken place. Go back to where you're from. I'll meet you there. Right? This is the risen Lord. They're thrilled that it's like, oh, this is great. You're going to destroy the temple. Good times are here. We're going to get rid of the Romans. It's all going to be great. He goes, well, check that. First, go back to Galilee. I'll meet you there. This is the risen Lord. And what we sort of extrapolated from that, starting with Bishop Curry, is when you meet the living Jesus, you are so changed. We are so changed that we go back to the communities we thought we knew, the neighborhoods, the houses, the neighbors, and see our community completely differently if we put on the lens of Jesus Christ, the risen Lord. It causes us to see. When you can see, you feel like the world has changed, but it's our capacity that has been changed. Jesus putting on Christ makes us vessels of the capacity of God's energy and power to do things we never thought was God working through us, doing things we never thought were possible. Go back to Galilee, go back to Winston-Salem, go back to Kernersville, go back to Davidson County, go back to the places you thought you knew, but see them completely differently. See people that you were taught to fear as your kin, as your blood kin through the blood of Christ. Go back to people you were taught to be afraid of and see your brother and sister and sibling in Christ. Do you see how revolutionary that is? Going to Galilee was we've been released out of a captive fear to sin, out of our captivity to just see the world as a place we needed to protect ourselves from, rather than a world that was offering us the possibility of greater harmony and greater beingness in the world. We're invited to go back. And of course, that didn't stop with Galilee, did it? Heck no. They went on from their hometowns and their neighborhoods, and they went up to they went up to Antioch, and they went over to Rome, and they went over. Thomas was sent over to Ethiopia and India, and they went out into the outermost parts. But first, they had to kind of go back and regroup and say, where does God need me now? They didn't go back and say, thank goodness that's over. That Holy Week thing, that was terrible. So glad that's done. No, they went forward a changed people in a new community. So that's where I ask the questions, how are we going to go forward now? And I guess that's where I really want to open it up for you all. How are we marked? How have we really been marked by this time of such incredible disruption, all kinds of disruption? And how will that experience be something we can use to go forward in faith and maybe do some things, see some things we hadn't seen, address some things we haven't addressed, try some things we haven't tried, and discover things that discover that invitation that I think God is always giving us to say, gosh, there's so much more to life. Come engaged in that with me. So that's my question to you this morning is, if we're going forward in faith, what might that really, really look like for you, for St. Paul's, for Winston-Salem, for Forsyth County, for the church? What might that look like?
You know, Bishop Ann, I'm really struck by how many people keep using the word unprecedented when it comes to these times. Like, we are in this unprecedented time. And you just led us through, talking about the exile in Exodus, and looking at the stories of scripture. And there's so much of the Old Testament that is sort of like God's people being like, this is the worst thing we've ever had to deal with ever. And then the next generation is like, no, it's this thing. And there's just this kind of hilarious almost pattern that happens with adversity in the world, and how God intervenes in the midst of that. And I guess, to your question, I'm curious about our relationship to the past and how we are engaging with, and I'm thinking particularly around the conversations in racial reconciliation, where there is this enormous privilege where people sort of say, and white people especially sort of say, well, now we'll wake up to all of these events that are happening and respond to them. And all of my friends who are people of color are like, great, welcome to the conversation that's been going on for a long time. And so I guess I'm interested in learning more from the past, in a way that says, yes, the pain that we feel now is new and hard, and yet it is also, we're not the first people to have suffered, and we're not the first people to really grapple with our differences and the ways that we have been violent and the ways that we have failed one another. We actually have a really great book for that.
Yeah.
um,
Stories, right.
yeah, I just think that's a big element to this, is to say, how are we actually being invited into a conversation backward as we move forward?
Right. There's a point in the Eucharist we call the anamnesis, where we bring the past into the present, right? We bring the crucifixion into the present and the resurrection in order to change the future. And so we're equipped to do this work with our theology, with how we tell story, right? The whole Eucharist is retelling a story, but it's bringing the past into the present because it's useful in terms of guiding us as we go forward. So yeah, Sarah, I think exactly. There's so much to reap from making sure, but there's so much we still don't know, right, about our past. One of the things, I don't know if you all have done this, but there's a process, I hate to use the word program, but there's an offering called Sacred Ground. Sarah, have y'all done any Sacred Ground listening circles?
We've had conversations in small groups with using that material, but not as a whole parish.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. And also the diocese is going to redo it and do some facilitator training. And what we're going to do is put North Carolina history. And it's a very much a kind of a going back and looking back in order to understand how did we get to where we are around the kind of racial division. So we're going to incorporate North Carolina history into that.
That's great. Yeah.
And we've written some grants to do some oral history, some archival history, so that when we're doing our own work, we're kind of getting pretty real with each other.
Let's see. Tina has her hand up. Tina,
Great.
You want to unmute and ask your question?
So I don't know that necessarily a question. I just thought it was such a wonderful comment that you made about your 33 years being a bishop or ordained or whichever it is, that instead of helping people, you want to walk alongside people. And that just makes me think about this last year. And I feel like we probably took for granted how much it is wonderful to be able to hug somebody, sit down with somebody, have a conversation. And I hope that coming out of the pandemic, we're all going to be better listeners and be able to view people as true individuals where I'm more interested in hearing about your story than just kind of, I don't know, just going through life, just like, oh, it's just another day. Do you know what I mean? Like just understanding a lot of people have a lot of stuff that they've been through. And so don't be so quick to try to fix something. Let's just sit together and let me be present with you and hear your story. And whether it is a horrible history based on what the white church did in North Carolina to the Black people, or whatever that story is we're talking about, just be more present and sensitive to hearing all the realities of what they're feeling.
Exactly, Tina. A book I recommend along these lines is called Living with Our Enemies by Marcia Owens and Sam Wells. And it's about it is important to do things for people. It's important to do things with people. It's important to be for certain things. Let's be for human rights, and important to be with. So you hear do for, do with, be for, be with. And it's the being with that we totally underestimate, the importance and the power of being with. And so there's a time to take a casserole. There's a time to fix a leaky pipe and build a habitat house. There are times to do things, but what we ignore is the power of presence, of our presence. You know, you would rather than when you're talking to someone who's not really listening. And then you know those times when nobody's talking, but everybody's really present. So yeah, Tina, you're right on it. The power of presence is critical. So other people pipe in with your observations are far more important and interesting than mine about where we go with this.
Sorry, this is Deborah. And it's really interesting. It's just kind of an awareness of, I'm kind of talking about the racial thing, black and white. And there was a wonderful course offered this fall called Waking Up White. The book was called Waking Up White. And Kathy led that. It was fantastic. And I happen to live on the east side of Winston, eastern side of Winston, downtown. And my kind of awareness and association, not so much association, but probably more awareness of the differences and, wanting to be more sensitive to the issues there has really grown. I mean, it's just when I drive down the street and that's the neighborhood I see now, it's really been a terrific thing. So, and I've, gotten involved with the Center of Hope downtown, which is of only family shelter in Forsyth County, and St. Paul's is doing Thursday night dinners there, which is awesome. But it just goes way beyond that. It's just like an awareness. I see people, it's like a whole different world. And I think how I lived in such a white world, not growing up, I didn't grow up here, went to Wake Forest and my kids grew up here and blah, blah, blah. But there's a whole lot to learn about how we can help and how we can interface. And it's just a whole different perspective for me now. And I live 3 minutes from the other side of town. Highway 52 separates us and I'm 3 minutes away. And so it's been a very great kind of waking up for me. Not that I've woken up enough, but there's a start there, and I'm really happy about that. So anyway,
yeah,
hope that's interesting to you.
Yes, no, Deborah, absolutely, amen, sister. I think while part of what I'm really interested in, and I think I'm going to spend a whole lot more time around this next year, is about trauma. And what I was trying to talk about a little bit in the sermon is that trauma lasts in the body, right? And I think we've been through a traumatic time, but I think we've been going through some traumas from birth, right? Birth itself is traumatic. I mean, the physically being born is traumatic. But I'm very interested in this because I think more awareness, Debbie, you're talking about, I'm aware. I think the more awareness we have, the more alive we are to what is and what could be, which includes awareness to things that we've been taught to ignore, right? Or not even see. And that certainly applies to racism, but it applies to all kinds of things, all kinds of, so I think the image of being awakened coming out. And I do think part of the weird thing about COVID is it could also make a lot of us pretty numb. I don't tell anybody, I loved working from home. I've never had like, my gosh, I'm sitting in my house in my yoga pants and my slippers, and I might put on a collar, but you have no idea, all that. Could walk my dog, all that, it's like, what happens if, we don't pay attention and we're numb to what's happened? And so I think being awake and being sensitive and being more putting on different lenses, all of that to me is very exciting and very invigorating, but we could miss those opportunities if we're not careful. Other comments about where are we going as the Jesus movement?
I think Elizabeth has her hand up.
Mhm. She's thinking. Come on,
Oh,
Elizabeth.
you're talking to me? Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you said Beth. I'm sorry. So have you ever heard of Russ Parker, who is an Episcopal or an Anglican priest in England? You should read his work. One of his best books is called Healing Wounded History. So he's very involved in reconciliation, forgiveness, blessing, and in healing ministry. And so he's been to Rwanda, he's been in Northern Ireland, he's been in Charleston, places where there's just big conflict. And that he is an amazing person, and he has liturgies, some about things like representational confession, which I think is related to what you're talking about, the racism things. And so there are lots of us here who meet with him regularly at various different conferences and things. So you might really enjoy reading his work.
Thank you. Yes, I've just wrote it down.
Yeah, but what is the name of the Sam Wells book? Living. I looked it up and I couldn't find it.
Well, I thought it was Living with Our Enemies, but maybe it's Loving Our Enemies. It's Sam Wells and Marcia Owens.
Okay, let me look. I'll look it up.
Mm-hmm. And while we're doing books, I hope y'all every now and then listen to Kristen Tippett on Being. And I listen to her when I get up very, 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 very early, because she's on my NPR station. She's on very, very, very early. She was interviewing a writer. I can't think of his name, but I can tell you his book. It's called My Grandmother's Hands. I just recommend you go first listen to her interview of the author of My Grandmother's Hands. He's a clinical psychologist in Minneapolis. And boy, does he have a lot of powerful things to say about carrying trauma in the body. And I just think we have more and more work to do to move that conversation into some Christian theology and reflection. And we're called to be part of the Jesus movement is about healing. Fundamentally, it is about healing. And so when you look at the word atonement, that word, you can actually look at the word atonement and it can say at one meant. At one meant. That's not about fixing somebody, right? That's about just bringing us together into a greater wholeness. That's not about making people fit a certain pattern or a certain definition of healthiness. It's saying, no, what's a healthy community that welcomes all sorts of bodies, right? All sorts of bodies, getting away from notions of perfection or any other kind of supreme language and back into notions of harmony and balance and equilibrium and healing. So a lot of stuff for us to do that will make practical. One of the things about My Grandmother's Hands is that it talks about practices. He doesn't call them exercises, practices that we can do like you do when you do reps. Do these practices, but repeat them and repeat them so we'll change our behavior as well as our awareness. And he's talking about, and it actually rewires your neurology. One of the things we're understanding is how there are things about trauma that we can actually rewire into to having ourselves more freed up, to be available and vulnerable and then actionable in our communities, not reactional. Other comments, where are we going? Where do you see some things that could be challenged or changed in our
the other thing, I just wanted to reiterate the book Waking Up White, because I just think it was fantastic. and how an interstate going up can divide communities. And so you never get on the other side and see what's going on. So it was really a great book. It was a book study, and it was so worthwhile. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
So Deborah, let me just, I hope y'all will do it again. And if you don't, the diocese has just done 2 iterations of a book study with Debbie Irving, with her. And so we're going to do that again in the fall. And we start with Debbie Irving, and she does a program, it's online. And then it has practices for several weeks. And then we end with the Reverend Dr. William Barber talking about his work in repairers of the breach, which is some answers. So we're going to do that. The diocese will do that again in the fall. So if St. Paul's doesn't have the chance to organize that book group around Waking Up White this summer, it's something you could piggyback on with the diocese in the fall. I couldn't agree with y'all more. And in fact, she's someone that we're working with at that diocesan level. You guys are sort of lucky. You have people that can do a lot of programming at just kind of at St. Paul's and within St. Paul's. But one of the discoveries during the pandemic was the power of pulling together folks from small churches. Maybe there's only a few people at some churches that are interested in a certain subject, but we can now put them in a Zoom room and in a facilitated process that lets us kind of cross-fertilize and collaborate across the diocese. That's been very liberating. And I think we're going to see more of that as we go along. And I think that'll build our bonds of affection as a diocese and appreciation, but then build the kind of bonds that actually lets us stretch in uncomfortable, can you hear the difference? I am going to be willing to be stretched into uncomfortable places because I feel like I'm with people who will also want to keep me valued and respected. Does that make sense? We create some safe space to also take risks of being hurt or misunderstood or you see it's a paradox, but I think it's possible. In my family, if we're doing our jobs right, someone can get it wrong, or we can tussle over something, but it's safe to tussle hard, right? Because the fundamentals of love and forgiveness are underneath all of that. So I think as the diocese moves in this direction, it's all about relationships, keeping the relationships strong while we also do some hard work together. And Zoom is actually going to help us with some of that. And I think it's great. I think it's quite exciting. Other observations that you're coming from this last year with? Jeannie Carr, you're being awfully quiet there. Don't think I don't see you in my own magic mirror romper room sort of way.
Hey, I'm quiet. I'm quiet.
That's fine. Just telling you I love you, and I know you're there. Jeannie and I go way back.
Yeah, back to your your Duke days.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Duke, but
you were on the Commission on Ministry and Higher Education or something like that.
I was on that commission that Bishop Estel started about, what was it? I don't know. We got to visit a lot of interesting places though.
Yeah. Other observations about this forward in faith, the Jesus movement.
Kathy, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I would. I've been very interested for quite some time in ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. And we had I thought, a very interesting presentation during one of our Faith and Justice presentations this past year. Very recently, one of the foundations in our city that was started by members of the Reynolds family is beginning to put together a coalition in the county to create a trauma-based community and to have collaboration from lots of different places who work with children to look at those, as you say, those traumas that come in childhood and literally rewire the brain and change the physiology of the body, which means that our community then has handicapped children in a larger sense. And I can't help but wonder if that collaboration and those resources going toward making us a trauma resilient community would have happened without the COVID pandemic. Would we have had eyes to see and ears to listen to see what science has told us in the last couple of decades about what happens when children experience trauma, and how many children in our county experience trauma? We are famous, you know, for being third from the bottom in economic mobility. And the only two counties in the United States who have a worse record of being able to work yourself out of poverty are in South Dakota and their two Native American reservations. And, you know, that's not a position to be proud of. So I think I'm echoing what you've said about our ability to see with new eyes when all of us have been in a place where we don't have control over what's happening, but it's become very, very clear that we're all in this together. And if one of us hurts, we all hurt. Right. And I'll end with, I have a niece whose views on life are quite different than mine. And we've come to the place where we simply don't talk about that a lot. But she put a posting on Facebook at the beginning of the pandemic. And she said, my grandfather, my father, was in a crisis of our country. And at 19, he learned how to shoot a gun, and he fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was hit by a sniper's bullet and came very close to dying. He recovered. And that's why I'm here. Probably a half an inch from ever existing, but I'm here. She went on to say, we're in a crisis in our country, and I'm being called on to help my country. I think I can sit on the sofa for a while. That's not too much to ask. And so I was very proud of her, even though we disagree so many times on so many things, and we're very much alike, which makes it even harder. I was very proud of that insight. So yeah, I think we are seeing with new eyes.
So I want to throw something out there, and I know, oh my gosh, we really have to stop. So, but on this subject, let me see, this is going to sound like a weird bridge, but let me go ahead and say it. Part of what the author, which is in the chat box of My Grandmother's Hands, brought up is the traumatic nature of how trauma lives for generations in the body. And he talks about the traumatic events of the Middle Ages in the way that people were tortured and abused, and how, and particularly in Anglo-Saxon culture, that got passed down in generational ways that then had implications for traumatized white people who came to the shores of what was called the Americas and brought that trauma with them. And so I'm really curious going forward to think about, how do our roots in a colonial empire, Great Britain, a very empire building, white male privilege system, what are we going to do with that history, right? What are we going to do with that history in a way that subverts or loses what needs to be lost without covering up or denying it, but also brings something from the past forward that is life-giving? I mean, thinking about Prince Philip's funeral yesterday, how much we love liturgy and pomp and circumstance. Can we have that if part of the dominion thinking is rooted in domination thinking? Right? I'll let me tell you, I am lifelong Episcopalian. I am not trying to, I will confess to a little bit of ambivalence about some of the things of our liturgical drama. I mean, putting on that mitre, I'm like, what what do I think about that? Putting on a collar? What do I think about that? I think we're going to have to examine everything and not be afraid to do that. Just like the British monarchy is going to have to think about things, right? I'm not a Presbyterian. I am not a Calvinist, although maybe a little bit. But we cannot be afraid to have some robust discussion about our history as Anglicans and what we can learn from the past and what we can take forward in ways that really makes us honest when we say all are welcome in the radical love of Jesus Christ. I find that exhilarating. I find it a little daunting, find it a little terrifying, but I find more comfort in doing that with you all than staying home and not doing it at all. That would really be terrible. So, well, I mean, we are just, oh yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
One more thing. So I just wanted to tell you, Bishop Ann, that this resonates with me on so many levels. I'm a physician. I do behavioral pediatrics. So I'm always working to try to get to the roots beyond the diagnosis. What are the roots of the problem that are often from family things in the past? And I do healing prayer and the OSL. I'm on the board for the North America, and we do all sorts of things about generational healing and healing of trauma and all that kind of thing. And I was, our kids were the only white kids, just almost, in a Black school for a while here in Winston-Salem. And, you know, I grew up in Charlotte when we were, so anyway, I resonate with you on lots of these things. If you just set up any kind of diocese and things that are trying to help people look at these things, maybe in a liturgical way or a prayer way. I love writing liturgies. I write prayers and things. I would love to help you.
Elizabeth, yes, anybody who'd like to follow up on this conversation and what we're talking about here, talk to Elizabeth and Sarah and Dixon, and I'll come back. I just think there's a lot here. And it sounds like to me, I watch the heads that are nodding and hear the things y'all are saying. So let me come learn more from you and with you, and then let's ask ourselves how we might build out to the diocese, build out to the church, go deeper here in Winston-Salem, but let's also build out in ways that other people can have these conversations. There's just, I'm behind on this, but I'm also saying, wait, this is what we've been talking about.
Also, one more thing is that in the Order of St. Luke, which, you know, you probably heard of OSL, but it was kind of getting old and gray and not all that lively. Well, it's super lively right now. And we're just doing things all over the country that are by Zoom. So now we have online healing communities and people are learning online together and all kinds of stuff is happening because of the pandemic. It's just really amazing. And now these people, we have mentors who live one place and young people who live another place who want to learn. So we're setting up apprenticeship kind of things. And we can do that in the diocese. I mean, you can have people from little bitty churches in a rural area and urban people, and who are all interested together in the same place on Zoom or whatever. And it is really amazing.
That is so great. And then I know Lauren Villemer-Drenth is also interested in all of this. So clearly, once again, St. Paul's is a vessel of God's grace and God's healing. And let's see where we can go from here. Thank you all so much for lingering.
You have given us so much to think about today. I'm so appreciative of this conversation and all the ways in which we are challenged and yet you know, I always love that image that you give us of, you know, we spend our lives in the Christian journey, either, you know, being sent out to go and do something, to go and do hard work, and then coming home again. And that's the journey back and forth. And you embody that and teach that so well for us. So thank you so much for being here and for this conversation. This might be a good time for us to wrap things up. I do want to remind folks that we'll continue with the formation hour up until Pentecost. And our next thing now that we are kind of switching to a new class, Dixon will be leading us starting next week in a Bible study. Dixon, do you want to say anything about that before we sign off?
Yeah, it's hi everyone, and Bishop Ann, thank you so much. Yeah, we're basically going to do some Bible stories or Bible study on the stories that you remember hearing like in Sunday school as a kid, but never show up in the lectionary again to be really mined and explored. So we're going to do Cain and Abel. We're going to do Noah and the flood. I mean, it's in the vigil. We're going to do Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. That shows up occasionally. We're going to do Daniel in the lion's den. So we're going to do some stuff that's like you remember hearing as a kid. It sort of hangs around the edges, but there's so much robust subversive content in these ancient texts that really, I mean, you want to talk about addressing the reality of empire through the lens of the kingdom of God, like that's what this text is consistently doing. So we're going to do some deep dive on that. It'll be fun. Again, you all keep clamoring for Bible study, and so we're happy to do it. So if you want to nerd out, join me for the next 4 weeks, and we will go down the geek rabbit hole.
Can that be the title of your class? Go down the geek rabbit hole?
Totally.
'Cause I would 100% come to a class that was called the geek rabbit hole. Maybe that could be the title of the podcast. All right, y'all. Well, thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Bishop Anne, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you today. Oh, you're muted.
And so I'm off to do a baptism at the Episcopal Center. I'm doing the visitation at Duke Episcopal Center this afternoon.
No
I do
way!
a baptism of a young adult. Woohoo!
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
keep us in your
That's
prayers.
awesome.
All right.
Such good stuff happening there.
Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody. Y'all have a good day.
Bye-bye.